Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal exciting news on Tuesday, July 1st, 2025. First, Anna and Chase raced to the scene the moment they received the emergency call. The air was thick with tension as they approached the site of the crash, where Natalia's vehicle lay overturned and crumpled along the side of a slick road just outside town. Shards of glass glistened beneath the flashing red and blue lights, and long skid marks painted a grim picture of a sudden, violent impact. It hadn't been long since Natalia had stormed out of Daisy's baptism, emotionally unstable and visibly shaken after being publicly rejected by Sunny. What started as a disruption at a sacred family ceremony had now escalated into a possible tragedy, with Natalia's name at the center of it all. Inside the church, the atmosphere had shifted from ceremonial grace to stunned disbelief. Sunny, still dressed in his formal suit, stood frozen as whispers rippled through the pews. Word of Natalia's accident hit like a thunderclap, and Sunny's heart sank with the weight of his own actions. He had demanded that she leave in front of everyone, turning his back on her in the most humiliating way. Now, with the knowledge that she may have been seriously injured, or worse, he was forced to confront the possibility that his cruelty had set in motion a deadly chain of events. Regret began to chip away at his composure, though his face betrayed none of the storm brewing within. Back at the crash site, Anna conducted a meticulous examination of the area while Chase coordinated with first responders and forensics. Something about the scene felt off. The speed at which Natalia had lost control, the odd trajectory of the vehicle, and most concerning of all, the absence of her phone, all these details hinted at more than just emotional recklessness. Anna crouched near the twisted driver's side door, noting faint abrasions on the seatbelt, as if it had been tampered with. Chase silently flagged the detail. This might not have been a tragic accident fueled by grief and haste, it could be evidence of sabotage, a calculated move to silence Natalia forever. As the investigation deepened, so did the questions about what Natalia might have known. Her heated encounter with Sunny was no isolated emotional outburst, it had been preceded by weeks of suspicious behavior, whispered conversations, and mysterious absences. Some speculated that she was on the verge of exposing something powerful, something that could have altered the public's perception of Sunny and others in his inner circle. If Natalia was indeed carrying a secret, and if someone feared it might come to light, then this crash could have been an act of desperation. The stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, and now every detail mattered. Meanwhile, Sunny spiraled in silence. The church, once a place of peace, now echoed with memories of what he had said, what he had done. Those closest to him could sense his inner collapse, though he refused to speak. He knew what the others were thinking. Had he pushed Natalia too far? Had he created the perfect storm for someone else to strike while her defenses were down? As suspicion mounted and public scrutiny intensified, Sunny stood at the edge of a moral cliff, caught between the truth he feared and the guilt he could no longer ignore. Natalia's crash was no longer just a personal tragedy, it was the spark that threatened to ignite a much larger fire. Second, Brennan had reached a critical threshold in his dealings with Jocelyn. For weeks, he had watched her maneuver through dangerous situations with an alarming sense of carelessness, treating her covert identity like a temporary disguise rather than a lifelong obligation. What once seemed like youthful boldness now looked like recklessness, and Brennan knew the consequences of exposure were too severe to leave unchecked. The mission, the operation, and the entire framework they had built were all at risk because Jocelyn was beginning to forget the cardinal rule. Secrecy wasn't optional, it was survival. So he drew a line. A firm, non-negotiable boundary that Jocelyn would not be allowed to cross again. Brennan didn't deliver his warning with anger, but with cold, exacting clarity. He issued a new set of rules, detailed, uncompromising, and specifically designed to limit Jocelyn's independent actions. She was no longer permitted to operate alone, make contact with anyone outside the approved network, or even leave her secured perimeter without clearance. The freedom she had once wielded like a weapon was gone. Brennan assigned Vaughn to monitor her full-time, not as a mentor, but as a shadow, a watchful figure who would report her every move. It was not a suggestion. It was a directive backed by the full weight of Brennan's authority, and refusal was not an option. Jocelyn felt the shift almost immediately. Vaughan's presence was constant, subtle enough to avoid public attention, but overwhelming in private. Every conversation, every glance, every breath she took now felt observed, measured, and stored for later review. Her attempts to challenge the restrictions were met with polite indifference and rigid enforcement. It wasn't just surveillance, it was control, meticulously executed to strip her of autonomy. The independence that had once defined her role was eroding, and though she bristled at the boundaries, there was no clear path forward that didn't end in compliance or expulsion. As the days passed, Jocelyn began to internalize the severity of Brennan's expectations. What she had thought was a collaboration had always been a command structure, and she was no longer trusted to make her own decisions. She had overstepped, and now she was paying the price. Every misstep, every careless word, every visible crack in her persona had been noted, catalogued, and used as justification for Brennan's clampdown. Vaughan never spoke about it, but his eyes told her everything. That this was her consequence, that her recklessness had invited a correction she could no longer avoid. Yet beneath the surface, Jocelyn understood something deeper. Brennan's harshness wasn't born out of cruelty, it was fear, tightly coiled and dressed as control. He couldn't afford to lose another asset, not to failure, not to exposure, and certainly not to emotion. But that didn't make it easier. For Jocelyn, this new reality was suffocating, and the walls around her seemed to close in more each day. She had no choice now but to submit, to obey the rules Brennan had laid out, and to endure Vaughan's constant presence like a leash she could not remove. Her world had changed, and the illusion of freedom had shattered. Third, Michael listened carefully as Sasha shared everything she had noticed, each strange occurrence, every unexplained moment that had unfolded around Daisy. At first, he had tried to rationalize her fears, thinking perhaps it was the natural anxiety of a mother still healing from past trauma. But as her voice trembled through the details, Michael began to realize the pattern. These weren't isolated events. There was a rhythm to them, a disturbing undercurrent that suggested something more sinister was at play. It wasn't just Sasha's worry, it was evidence, and it forced him to face a terrifying possibility. Daisy might not be as safe as he had believed. The realization hit Michael hard. He felt a cold weight in his chest as he looked at Sasha, understanding now that her fear wasn't just emotional, it was deeply justified. Gone was the gentle doubt he had once held when Sasha sounded the alarm. Now, in its place, was a sharp, unshakable sense of urgency. He reached out to comfort her, gently placing his hand on hers, silently communicating what words could not. He believed her. He was with her. They were in this together. Sasha's expression softened, just slightly, as though the pressure around her heart had loosened. It was the first time in days she had felt truly seen. Michael wasted no time. He immediately began coordinating steps to protect Daisy. He contacted security professionals to evaluate and fortify their home, expanded surveillance coverage, and set up private monitoring at all of Daisy's frequent locations, her daycare, her doctor's office, even the park. Every moment of her day was accounted for. He quietly reached out to trusted contacts, including Jason, knowing that he needed eyes beyond what the public systems could offer. Michael understood now that loving Daisy wasn't enough. Protecting her demanded action, precision, and absolute commitment, especially when the danger wasn't loud or obvious, but quiet, creeping, and deliberate. Throughout this whirlwind of planning and strategy, Michael never lost sight of Sasha. He stayed close, speaking gently, offering reassurance when her voice faltered and her hands trembled. He knew how easily fear could become isolation, how quickly guilt could morph into shame. But Sasha had nothing to be ashamed of. Her instincts had pulled them both out of denial and into action. Michael reminded her of that every chance he got, that her voice had saved their daughter from invisible threats, that her courage had forced the truth to the surface. He wouldn't let her forget it. And more importantly, he wouldn't let her carry this alone. At night, Michael found himself watching Daisy with a different kind of gaze. There was still love in his eyes, but now it was laced with a deeper intensity, one born from fear and a vow. He had almost missed the signs. Had Sasha not spoken up, he might have let danger slip by in the guise of normal life. But now he was alert. Now he was ready. Whatever or whoever was behind the strange events surrounding Daisy, Michael would find them. And he would do it not just as a father protecting his child, but as a man making up for every second he spent thinking everything was fine. Fourth, Alexis walked briskly down the corridor of the heavily guarded detention facility, her heels echoing against the linoleum floor as if announcing her arrival with deliberate resolve. She had not come here lightly. The last time she stood face to face with Sidwell, the encounter had ended in veiled threats, psychological warfare, and a bitter standoff. Sidwell had tried to assert his dominance, laying down demands Alexis refused to entertain. She had held her ground, walking away with her integrity intact. But today, the stakes were no longer personal, they were broader, more urgent, and they forced her to revisit the very man she had once vowed never to speak to again. When the metal door slid open and Alexis stepped inside the dim visitation room, she saw Sidwell already seated, composed as ever, his hands folded on the table with an almost theatrical stillness. There was a glint in his eyes that she had not missed, a quiet amusement, perhaps, that she had returned to him after all. Alexis sat down without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her squirm. This was not a negotiation of equals. She came with purpose, and she would not let Sidwell's history of manipulation cloud her intent. Still, beneath her calm demeanor, she was acutely aware that she had entered the lion's den once more. The subject matter she laid before Sidwell was not trivial. It involved a matter of growing urgency, one that could not be solved through ordinary channels. A threat, buried beneath layers of corruption and misinformation, was starting to rise. Alexis had traced it back through fragments of evidence, political whispers, and corporate obfuscation, and now, all signs pointed to a shadow network Sidwell had once operated within. His insight, his connections, even his grudges could hold the key to unearthing the next move in a game that no one else even realized was being played. Alexis hated needing him. But her pride meant nothing if it came at the cost of lives. Sidwell listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on her like a predator studying a potential opening. He didn't nod. He didn't ask questions. But Alexis knew him well enough to recognize when his mind was working behind the stillness. As she finished outlining the stakes, the room remained quiet for several unbearable seconds. Then, slowly, Sidwell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. He wasn't going to help out of charity or remorse. If he helped at all, it would be because the situation amused him, intrigued him, or offered him an advantage. Alexis prepared herself for the moment he would name his price. True to form, Sidwell didn't respond with immediate cooperation. Instead, he began outlining his own conditions, measured, strategic, and deliberately vague. Alexis expected this. He would want something, perhaps access to restricted communications, a shift in his confinement terms, or worse, information. She took in each of his demands with steely composure, weighing the risk, calculating the fallout. Some terms she would reject outright. Others she might consider, if it meant preventing the wider disaster looming on the horizon. She wasn't naive. Working with Sidwell was like playing chess with a cobra. But she hadn't come this far to walk away empty-handed. As the visit concluded and the guards prepared to escort her out, Alexis turned back briefly for one final look. Sidwell remained seated, watching her with the air of someone who had been reawakened. For a man locked away, he still had power, and Alexis knew she had just lit the fuse on something volatile. She walked out with the same determination she had entered with, but now, her burden was heavier. She had struck a match in a room full of gasoline. And whatever fire came next, she would have to be ready to contain it. Because Sidwell never gave anything away without changing the rules of the game. Finally, Molly lingered near the gallery entrance longer than she had intended, her heart weighed down by a swirl of emotions she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. She had arrived on a whim, hoping to catch a glimpse of Cody, perhaps exchange a few casual words. But what she saw instead froze her in place. Cody standing close to Ava, their posture relaxed, their laughter easy, the kind of closeness that hinted at a shared history or something deeper forming. The sight struck her with a sharp pang of unease, one that bloomed quietly into jealousy. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was nothing, that they were just talking. But the ache in her chest told a different story, one she wasn't ready to admit. For days, Molly had brushed off the tension she felt around Cody as coincidence. She had convinced herself she was simply being cautious, misreading things, or responding to a temporary sense of confusion. She wasn't someone who acted on impulse or let emotions cloud her judgment. Yet, the sight of Cody with Ava had made something raw and undeniable surface. She cared. And not just in a friendly, distant way. There was a growing connection she had refused to label, one that now pulsed at the forefront of her mind with startling clarity. The idea of losing Cody to someone else, especially someone as bold and magnetic as Ava, was more painful than she was prepared to handle. When she finally gathered the courage to speak to Cody, her thoughts jumbled and her voice almost failed her. But Cody, sensing something was off, didn't wait for her to speak first. Instead, with a rare seriousness in his tone, he explained what had happened with Ava. Their interaction had been casual, rooted in shared connections and art circles, nothing romantic or complicated. He knew how it must have looked and wanted to clear the air before Molly let it fester into something worse. His honesty, calm and unfiltered, reached her in a way that no grand gesture ever could. For once, she didn't feel dismissed or misunderstood. She felt seen. Molly listened intently, her pulse slowing as each of Cody's words helped unravel the anxiety coiled in her chest. She hadn't expected such clarity from him, hadn't dared to hope that he would take her feelings seriously without needing her to spell them out. But he had. There was no condescension in his tone, no attempt to make light of her concern. Instead, there was a gentle respect, a quiet acknowledgement that what she felt mattered. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something just as valuable, a foundation of trust that allowed her to let go of the worst-case scenarios she had been clinging to. The conversation left Molly quieter than usual, but calmer. Her mind was no longer clouded with doubt, and her heart, though still cautious, had begun to ease its defenses. Cody hadn't promised anything, but he had offered reassurance, and for Molly, that was enough, for now. She had spent so long guarding herself from unexpected emotions that she hadn't noticed how far she'd already fallen. And yet, instead of retreating further into logic and self-protection, she allowed herself to rest in that moment of clarity, letting it sink in that her feelings were real, valid, and possibly even reciprocated. As she walked away from him, a gentle breeze brushing past, Molly felt the faintest sense of hope stirring in her chest. The fear that had shadowed her thoughts had begun to lift, replaced by a tentative belief that something good might come of this connection. She still didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't ready to leap blindly into something uncertain. But the path ahead no longer seemed so daunting. With Cody's explanation echoing softly in her mind, Molly felt just a little more at peace, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile. As Molly stepped into the quiet evening air, a soft breeze brushed against her skin, carrying away the lingering weight of doubt that had haunted her since seeing Cody with Ava. The conversation they'd shared stayed with her, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the steady warmth of reassurance. Cody's honesty had grounded her, gently pulling her back from the edge of overthinking and self-protection. She no longer felt trapped by uncertainty. Instead, she moved with a lightness that came from understanding of herself, of her feelings, and of the quiet bond beginning to form between them. Though she didn't have all the answers, Molly finally stopped running from what she felt. She realized that vulnerability didn't have to mean weakness, it could be a quiet act of courage. Cody hadn't made promises or grand gestures, but the sincerity in his voice had been enough to show her that she wasn't alone in this. It was a fragile beginning, a delicate thread connecting them, but it was something. And for someone like Molly, who had always lived by reason and restraint, that fragile hope was a powerful step forward. As she walked home beneath the fading colors of sunset, Molly let herself breathe in the stillness, her thoughts no longer clouded by jealousy or fear. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, she was open to the possibilities. Whatever came next, with Cody, with herself, she would face it not with walls, but with quiet openness. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the evening sky, Molly felt more like herself than she had in a very long time.